All right, we're going to look at four of Herbert's short lyric poems today. And they're rather diverse in their topic and subject matters, but I think they're each one of them delightful in their own way. The poems concerned are virtue, Jordan 2, man, and then finally life. So all one single subject poems. And like many in this corpus of poems, the temple devoted to a specific object related in some ways to the body of Christian life. Remember, the temple is the place in which God was worshipped through sacrifice. The themes of sacrifice and the types of and varieties of worship are manifold in the poems of Herbert. I want to start off with this poem Virtue, but let me begin by sort of a definition of virtue, and we're going to find that Herbert plays on multiple senses of virtue here. So the most common one, I suspect, which most people would immediately understand, at least in reference to virtue, is a conformity to a standard of rectitude, like morality, a virtuous person. And so it's a sort of a moral excellence of some sort. But the virtue of something can also be a beneficial quality, or the power. The virtue of a cordial is what lends it its potency. It gives it a sense of power, as I say. And that can also be the virtue of something. It can refer more specifically to courage or valor. That's usually one of the applications of virtue rather than a definition per se. It can also just be a commendable quality or trait of someone. And that gives it a particular, again, a potency. Something of its virtue is the thing that gives it its strength. And with respect to women, it often can refer to chastity, a woman's virtue. But again, these are applications rather than definitions. So with respect to man and manhood, it can refer to courage, valor, so forth. With respect to women, to chastity. But again, these are application specific and not really definitions of it. The first ones are more correct, I think. So a moral excellence or a conformity to rectitude, the virtue in the sense of the power or quality of the thing, which is in turn commendable. And you could even talk about virtues as an order of angels. I don't think that Herbert has that in mind here, but let's look at the poem and then we'll see what we can glean from that. But I think you'll see that the senses that I've described so far are there to be found in the poem. So this is the poem, Virtue. Let me read it first, and then we'll make a comment. It's 4 stanzas, and you'll note just from looking at the page that there's a remarkable parallelism in it. 3 lines of the same meter in roughly rhythm, alternating rhyme, bright sky, night, die. That carries throughout the poem. And again, there are 4 stanzas with the exact same parallels in it, but there within that repetition, there is also variation, and the variation is part of the style. And these are basic artistic principles that hold in poetry as well. The 2 artistic principles are repetition and variation. If you don't have a standard to repeat, then you don't even notice what the variation is. So in general, poetry works through patterns of repetition. And then, only then, when we've noticed the pattern, can we notice the variation. And this is often where the themes arise and the particular excellence of the poet makes his virtue known. The poem is called Virtue. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky, the dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. Sweet rose, whose hue angry and brave bids the rash gazer wipe his eye, thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie, my music shows you have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives. But though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. So I think you can see what I mean about the pattern of repetition and variation here. The first three stanzas contain the repetition. First of all, in the very first word of the three stanzas, the word sweet, applied variously to the day, first of all, then the rose, and then the spring, which is the composite of the days and the roses. And so the third represents a sort of summary statement, and it draws it to a closure, as it were, before varying in the fourth stanza to something altogether different. And what is altogether different is the soul. Unlike the day and the rose and the spring, the soul is a very different sort of thing because it's a spiritual entity, whereas the other are physical entities. So there's a contrast being made between the physical and the spiritual, the body and the soul here, as it were. Let me go back a little bit here. So first of all, the day, cool, calm, and bright. The trisyndactic ascendetic tricolon here, so cool, so calm, so bright. Presented as the bridle of the earth and sky. Wonderful image. The day which unites these things together in light, and then images of morning, which we see seasoned throughout the poem. The end of the day is wept by the dew that falls. Why should it weep? Because, as it says in the refrain, for thou must die. Second stanza, move on to a rose. Again, suggestions and connotations of weeping and sorrow. Why? Because this time the sorrow comes from the fact that the rose, which is beautiful, nonetheless has thorns. So the very brightness of the rose actually is the very thing that brings about the sorrow with it, just like the brightness of the day leads to the dew at night. So similarly, the sweetness and brightness of the rose brings people to seek to seize it rather rashly and leads them to tears. But here the death is because the roots of the rose lie in the ground. And of course, the ground is the source of human life and the source from which human life will return, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And again, the refrain, for thou must die, moves now to and thou must die. The third builds on that. As I say, the composite of the first two, sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie. Now you can think of a box of chocolates here. Sweets in British English refers to chocolates, just like pudding refers to what we would in North America call dessert, so a whole plenitude of things. Like in an opposite way, sweets often refer to chocolates, a box of sweets here, although it isn't necessarily so, but they lie there in the ground and here in a box. My music, and his reference here is a musical one, so the stops or closes to a piece of music. My music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. So it is a summary statement, but again, it's the same refrain of dying at the end of each of the three stanzas. This leads us, though, to the turn, the twist in the tale at the end. And the exception, the one sole exception to the rule, which is this, and it's the first time he mentions virtue. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives, but though the whole world turned to coal, then chiefly lived. Now, what does the seasoning have to do with the soul? And how does that fit together with the theme already established of mourning and weeping and death? Well, because seasoning comes with suffering. And he's talking here about what he also, what Donne talks about in canonization, namely the theme of sanctification, but sanctification by means of suffering, the means by which God purifies the soul. And he purifies it not by removing impurities, but rather by causing affliction. And the affliction gives us character, and character gives us hope, and hope does not disappoint, for God has poured out his Spirit upon us, and this is upon the human soul. So note that whereas other things, mourning is a sign of their death, and closely associated with that, here mourning or affliction is associated not with death, but rather with the opposite, with a sign of purification. It's God's means of purifying the Christian soul and treating the Christian soul in the same way that the Lord Jesus was purified, namely through his suffering. And he thereafter tasted death, but he did not remain dead. He swallowed up death and rose from the dead. And so the conclusion, and it is a comparison here, but though the whole world turned to coal, which is what we've seen in the first 3 stanza, in the case of the soul, at the point where suffering and affliction comes to the soul, then ye chiefly live. So when we die physically, when we are afflicted physically, bodily, these are not signs of death, but rather the opposite. So again, a very Christian interpretation of virtue, and I think quite a wonderful poem. So let me move from that poem to virtue. Now, virtue, it's virtue 2, first of all, it's virtue. Jordan 2, we've already looked at Jordan 1 and saw that Jordan 1 was on the topic of poetic inspiration. You would have, at least I would not have immediately attributed the Jordan with poetic inspiration, but Herbert did. And it begs the question of why he would make the Jordan of all places the source of poetic inspiration. And if you recall, we looked at how he looked at poetic inspiration, first of all, from the vantage point of the classical world and the means of poetic excellence were the standards of the classical world. And he knew them, he held himself up to them, but he didn't find them appropriate. And again, remember, we're thinking about poet here as Herbert here as a devotional poet, thinking about how as a Christian, he should look at the topic of true poetry and poetic inspiration. And he uses the Jordan as the object of meditation for this. Now, why would that be? Well, the Jordan is the place through which the people of God pass on their way through to the promised land, first of all. A place that is to be different than the lands around them. It's to be a land devoted to God, and it reflects God's holiness and goodness. So that it has that sense. So it should be not like the other nations, not like the other standards of excellence, but have its own particular virtue, if you will. Secondly, the Jordan is the place where John the Baptist was baptizing people in the name of God, and Jesus himself was baptized there. So it has a sense of using the poetic forms of the ancient world, and yet consecrating and then utilizing them to a better purpose in the same way that Augustine speaks of in De Doctrina Christiana, when he talks about God's command to the Israelites to plunder the Egyptians and take their gold, which Augustine uses as a grand metaphor for how Christians should regard pagan culture, not to totally disregard it, but rather to take what is good and repurpose it for its proper intention, which it was not being used for in the land of Egypt. So let me look at this poem, Jordan 2, and we'll see that it is rather different than the first one in form, but also in its content as well. So let me share the screen here. 3 stanzas, first of all. But again, very personal. When first my lines of heavenly joys made mention, such was their luster, they did so excel, that I sought out quaint words and trim invention. My thoughts began to burnish, sprout, and swell, curling with metaphors, a plain intention, decking the sense, as if it were to sell. Thousands of notions in my brain did run, offering their service. If I were not sped, I often blotted what I had begun. This was not quick enough, and that was dead. Nothing could seem too rich to clothe the sun, much less those joys which trample on its head. As flames do work and wind, When they ascend, so did I weave myself into the sense. But while I bustled, I might hear a friend whisper, how wide is all this long pretense? There is in love a sweetness ready penned. Copy out only that and save expense. Remember, Herbert here is a Puritan poet whose commitment is, first of all, to in writing the poems, these are devotional poems to God, but he's writing as a poet, and so his poetry itself needs the formal, appropriate formal qualities that will be suitable to his devotion. Now, God does not want devotion of the sort that is given to other gods. In fact, he forbids graven images, among other things, but also he wants to be recognized for who he genuinely is. And of course, one of his distinctive features is the fact that he speaks, unlike the dumb, mute idols of the nations around them. And secondly, that he has shown himself to be a savior. He brings his people out of the land of Egypt and redeems them, purchase them. And he does this first in the Exodus event, but also we can see the same thing in the life of Jesus Christ. He takes them from the land of bondage to sin and slavery and delivers them to the new kingdom, the kingdom of God. So he, in thinking of pondering on his own poetry, talks about how at first, in order to honor God, he utilized the typical trappings of good poetry. Speaking of heavenly joys, he sought out quaint words and trim invention, all sorts of poetic vocabulary, which he knew from, again, his extensive learning, which we know Herbert was. He was a scholar and a brilliant orator, using with metaphors of plain intention, curling them, decking the sense, as it were, to sell. He's trying to make something that is plain and good into something that is better. The implication, however, and the irony of it, which he plainly reveals, is that his attempts to make it better actually make it worse. That doesn't stop him from doing it. That's the second stanza. Thousands of notions in my brain did run, offering their service if I were not sped. And he keeps on correcting himself. This was not quick enough. That was dead. He is his own worst critic, judging his own work and finding it wanting. And it again refers back to the typical metaphors of the sun being clothed with richness and the joys. His head is trampled on. Again, these are stock symbols of bathos as much as pathos. But quite simply at the end, he abandons all of that pretense. He abandons the trappings of excessively florid language, and a voice speaks to him, just as it did in the poem Love 3. How wide is all this long pretense? There is in love a sweetness. Now remember, we just dealt with this word sweetness back in the poem Virtue. Ready penned, copy out only that and save expense. Save your money, save your time. Deal with plain, simple language rather than copying the efforts of eloquence of the ancients. Augustine, if you want to go back to some of my earlier lectures and different courses, in the fourth book of De Doctrina Christiana, talks about wisdom and eloquence and how to be eloquent, which is not by emulating the ancients and in their style, and talks about a particularly Christian style. Those meditations might as well have been written by Herbert here, because he shares the same sentiments. And remember, Herbert himself was the orator at Cambridge. So no doubt he had the capacity for doing just that. Let me then move on to the third of the poems I am going to look at today. This one's called Man. This is the more, I would say, the most complex of the poems, and it's the longest of the poems I'm going to look at as well. And the reason I chose it, and there was a so many poems we could have chosen, but the reason I chose this particular one is because it made a rather clear distinction between the tendencies of John Donne and that of George Herbert. Donne, if you recall, tended to use the microcosm-macrocosm analogy. And so he compared man to a little world. I am a little world made cunningly of elements and an angelic sprite, says Donne. Using the sort of classical idea of man as a small cosmos whose everything true of us is also true of the world, which we can find in Platonic thought. We can find the same thing, quite frankly, throughout Greek thinking. There are four basic elements, we're composed of them, etc., etc. There's nothing particularly distinctive about man except the soul or the spirit that's been placed in man. Donne will reiterate that more or less. Herbert's treatment is rather different. He wants to talk about the particularly distinctive features of mankind that differentiate him from the rest of the created order. So he's rather going against the microcosm, macrocosm analogy, which we see as favored of Donne. And this is important because, again, we're going to call both of them metaphysical poets, but note how the different tendencies arise from them. Let me read it for you, and I'm going to apologize because it's a bit lengthier, but not too long, I trust. But let me just read. Man, my God, I heard this day that none doth build a stately habitation, but that he means to dwell therein. What house more stately hath there been, or can be, than is man, to whose creation all things are in decay? For man is everything and more. He is a tree, yet bears no fruit. A beast, yet is or should be more. Reason and speech we only bring. Parrots may thank us if they are not mute. They go upon the score. Man is all symmetry, full of proportions, one limb to another, and all to all the world besides. Each part may call the farthest brother, and head with foot hath private amity, and both with moons and tides. Nothing hath got so far, but man hath caught and kept it as his prey. His eyes dismount the highest star. He is in little all the sphere. There's the microcosm analogy there. Herbs gladly cure our flesh because that they find their acquaintance there. For us the winds do blow, the earth doth rest, heaven move, and fountains flow. Nothing we see but means our good, as our delight or as our treasure. The whole is either our cupboard of food or cabinet of pleasure. The stars have us to bed. Night draws the curtain, which the sun withdraws. Music and light attend our head. All things unto our flesh are kind in their descent and being, to our mind in their ascent and cause. Each thing is full of duty. Waters united are our navigations, distinguished our habitation, below our drink, above our meat. Both are our cleanliness. Hath one such beauty, then how are all things neat? More servants wait on man than he'll take notice of. In every path he treads down that which doth befriend him. When sickness makes him pale and wan, O mighty love, man is one world and hath another to attend him. Since then, my God, thou hast so brave a palace built, O dwell in it, that it may dwell with thee at last. Till then, afford us so much wit, that as the world serves us, we may serve thee, and both thy servants be. So a brilliant poem. He begins with the idea, which, and I think he takes this then from scripture, when first David asks to build God a house, God denies David his request because he's a man of blood, but he does grant it to Solomon, his son. But the initial response to the request is, shall God reside in a human habitation? What need does God have of this? Nonetheless, he grants the request to build this habitation, which then becomes the temple. Now here, with that scriptural reference in mind, Donne has that, and he applies it here now to the tabernacle or the temple, which is mankind. Now in John 1:14, we read that the Lord Jesus pitched his tent among us. He took on flesh and pitched his tent among us. He tabernacled, he became mankind. But the language of the King James Version suggests that he became a temple, he in his flesh. That is so the incarnation is also in mind here in Herbert's poem devoted to man. It's not just man in the sense of an ordinary man, but also with that manifold sense of God becoming man. And that's how the poem concludes. But let me not get ahead of myself. The structure of the poem is, again, fairly similar. You can just see it on the page for yourself. The indentation, the first lines, and the second and the fifth lines moving to the left side of the page. I'm not sure if this is the case in the temple as it's written by Donne, but I wouldn't be that surprised of it. Note that the rhyme scheme is rather different than we normally would expect. So day, habitation, therein, being, creation, decay. Day, decay, thing. It's all over the place. Bring, more, score, symmetry. So it varies quite significantly between the lines. It doesn't have the usual patterns of similitude that we would expect, or at least not, they're more complex in this one. But it's more thematic, and the theme is man, and the parallelisms that Donne would ascribe to. Herbert does likewise. He does see the similitudes, but his point is to say how unlike man is from all these other things, because not only does man have a soul, but God also becomes a man, and God creates man as the crown of his creation. So the idea of the special nature of mankind is the real focus of this poem, and particularly in light of the fact that God himself condescends to take on human flesh and pitch his tent among us, or tabernacle amongst us, in the person of his son, Jesus Christ. So, my God, I heard this day that none doth build a stately habitation, but that he means to dwell therein. What house more stately hath there been, or can be, than is man? Now, he could have in mind original mankind here. God has created man in his own image, we read in Genesis 1. In his own image and likeness, to whose creation all things are in decay. Well, that hints at the fall there, but let's not get off on that. Let's just stick with the main theme here. For man is everything and more. He is a tree. Echoes or evokes the lines of Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who is planted like a tree, with streams of living water and so forth. Blessed is that man who walks not in the path of sinners, etc., but he stands firm, and he is like a tree here. So there's wisdom to him, and yet he bears no fruit. He's like a beast, and yet he should be more. And he has reason and speech. Parrots have speech as well, but they don't have reason. They just simply repeat what they hear. Man, on the other hand, is all symmetry, all proportion, and all to all the world besides. Each part is united in this. This is almost echoing Donne in his idea that no man is an island unto himself, and ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. When one man dies, I am diminished, because man is both an individual and part of a fraternity of fellow men. And likewise, the head and the foot, as different as they are parts of one body. So this is, again, reflections on the same theme with different variations here. And nothing hath got so far but man hath caught it and kept it as his prey. and everything. So it talks about the ways in which mankind is distinct, and I think they're quite compelling and quite beautiful. Everything becomes our delight, our treasure. Nothing we see but means our good. The whole world is created for us. We have attendants upon us, servants upon us. We're told that even angels are minister to God's people. The stars take us to bed. The sun wakes us up. Light and music attend our head. Everything else attends to our flesh. As with respect to the body, all things unto our flesh are kind in their descent and being, whereas to our mind, they are to our kind in their ascent and cause. So part of us is pulled down, the other part of us is pulled up. But again, the sense of what holds it all together is man. And everything is full of duty. Duty to what? Duty to us. Waters are there for our navigation. They're separated or distinguished, as he uses the word here, for our habitation. The waters below are for our drink. The waters above, the creatures above are for our meat, and both are our cleanliness. Hath one such beauty, how are all things neat? Finally, when this world, this microcosm becomes sick, another world comes along and attends it. Everyone is a servant to man, including his fellow man. But the conclusion is the wonderful flourish that ties it all together. And it does, once again, as I said at the outset, bring to mind the incarnation. Since then, my God, thou hast so brave a palace built, the one that all mankind shares, namely the image of God, oh, dwell in it. Become man, that it may dwell with thee at last. Till then, afford us so much wit, that so much knowledge, so much insight, that as the world serves us, we may serve thee, and both thy servants be. So he concludes with the proper end of man, which is what, according to the Westminster Shorter Catechism, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. What's the chief end of man? That is the answer to that first question from the Westminster Shorter Catechism. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Likewise here, the chief end of God become man was for Jesus to glorify God and take delight in the Father's delight. Likewise, the Father was well pleased in his one and only begotten Son, who served his fellow man by becoming, first of all, becoming a servant and then dying to atone for their sins, not his. So, man, let me come to the final of the poems that I want to look at. And this is the short little lyric, Life. Similar to the others and different. I'll just read it. I made a posy while the day ran by. Here will I smell my remnant out and tie my life within this band. But time did beckon to the flowers, and they by noon most cunningly did steal away and withered in my hand. My hand was next to them, and then my heart I took without more thinking in good part time's gentle admonition, who did so sweetly death's sad taste convey, making my mind to smell my fatal day, yet sugaring the suspicion. Farewell, dear flowers, sweetly your time ye spent, fit while ye lived for smell or ornament, and after death for cures. I follow straight without complaints or grief, since if my scent be good, I care not if it be as short as yours. So this is in many ways, very similar to his poem Virtue, because again, he is touching on the sadness and brevity of life, and yet also the sweetness of life, and the way in which all these things, which are apparent contradictions, are actually images of the same sort of sweetness of life, which is connected with a life of suffering, namely the life of those that carry the cross as Jesus did, and therefore are afflicted with suffering and with pain. So the posy which he makes, this bunch of flowers, which he holds in his hand and ties with a band to keep them together, quickly dies. As you know, when you cut fresh flowers, they don't last very long, and they wither in his hand. But of course, they leave the scent of the roses upon his hand, and the hand was next to them, and then his heart, because again, the roses which that he made the posy of, he probably intended on giving to a beloved, and so they were a symbol of his affection. And so it's not only his hand that smells of the beauty of the roses, but also his heart is in the withered roses. And he meditates upon this and sees it as an admonition, as a warning to him that time waits for no man, that everyone will have his hour and his day for death. And so he thinks about that, and thinks not only about the fate of the flower, but about his own fate as a mortal man. And he concludes with this encouragement, which is in the form of a farewell. Farewell, dear flowers. Again, this word sweet, sweetly your time ye spent, fit while ye lived for smell or ornament, and after death for cures. So flowers after they have died can be used for teas and cordials and so forth, to cure ailments. So even in death, the dead thing is useful. It has a virtue to it, which is gives a potency that actually aids life. And so again, the metaphor of something that's dead that actually enhances or aids or empowers life is one that he consistently appeals to, and he does so here. And it reminds him of his own death. He says, I follow straight without complaints or grief, since if my scent be good, I care not if it be as short as yours. Because the outcome of his death will also be a sweet life, because he will spend it face to face with God. So that's the conclusion of today's little study in the 4 short lyric poems, Virtue, Jordan 2, Man, and Life. I hope you have enjoyed them.